Okay, so we're going to now get into the main event, and it's my pleasure to introduce Major Ted King, our speaker for the evening. Major King graduated from the Royal Military College in 1963 and worked as a radio officer and navigator with the RCAF. In 1972, he had his first experience with search and rescue flying, and this changed the course of his career and resulted in his involvement with the Canadian Mission Control Centre of the then SARSAT research project. He retired from the RCAF in 1995 with the rank of Major, and from 1995 until his actual retirement in 2005, he continued to work on the COSPAS-SARSAT system, which he's going to be talking about tonight. He received a commendation from the U.S. Coast Guard for his behind-the-scenes work supporting a rescue in the Gulf Stream during a hurricane in 2005. Major King continues to enjoy sailing and ballroom dancing, hobbies that he has pursued since his days at the Royal Roads Military College. And tonight he's going to speak on Heavenly Help to the Rescue. Major King.
Well, thank you for the nice introduction. As a person in the Air Force, you might wonder why we're here talking about these kinds of things and what that has in common with astronomy. It actually is quite a bit. When I graduated from high school, the Russians had just launched Sputnik, so there was a lot of interest in space. And I recall at university, we had to go through differential equations trying to figure out how to do what the Russians just did, which is a pretty complex task when you look at the mechanics behind launching a payload into space. And now at the same time, I was also a navigator in the Air Force, and we relied upon all the work that was done by astronomers in the past because celestial navigation was the primary means of navigation, and I did use those skills traveling all over this planet, using just the sun, the moons, the planets, and the stars to guide me. So now that's all changed because of GPS, but I gather it is coming back in a way. So what do we have in common after that is that while astronomers are up there looking at what's going on outside of the Earth, we are up there in space looking the other way for what's going on down here on the planet. And just to, so you don't get too muddled in my presentation, we tend to use a lot of acronyms in big projects. And the three important acronyms are the different definitions we have for distress beacons. They use the ELT, which is an emergency location transmitter. It's for airplanes. EPIRB's emergency positioning indicating radio beacon, which is used for boats. And personal locator beacon, which is normally used for people, but they're sometimes used in airplanes, sometimes used in boats. In fact, that's becoming much more prominent, as you'll see as we get towards the end. You'll keep seeing these terms pop up in the presentation, but basically they all work in the same distress frequency, and they all do the same thing with a few subtle differences. You know, for example, an EPIRB will be float. It'll float. It'll be more waterproof. An airplane ELT will usually have a G switch in it. So I've got a quick video here that just will give you an idea what these different beacons are and what they do. This was done by the COSPAS-SARSAT organization. It is on their official website.
The COSPAS-SARSAT beacon is a radio-based transmitter. Technically, the way that it works is the user, which is actually going to be the victim that is in dire need of being saved, hits the button. There is an antenna that is hooked to the beacon itself. The antenna is the mechanism to allow transmittance of the signal, which is a signal that is meant just for search and rescue. So the signal itself gets beamed into space, where we have hardware instruments orbiting around space waiting to actually pick up that signal.
Each of the beacons is designed for the environment it's designed to work in. So EPIRBs are designed for use at sea, ELTs are designed for use on aircraft, and PLBs are for personal use by people in a range of different environments. The unique thing about EPIRBs is most EPIRBs are water activated. So the EPIRB would normally be mounted in a bracket on board a ship, but when you take it out you effectively arm it, and then as soon as you get it wet it will start to automatically transmit. This is a fairly typical modern 406 megahertz ELT. Basically what you have is the ELT. Within the ELT is a G switch. So if you hit it like this, you apply a G-force or a gravity force of in excess of about 4G, then the ELT will activate. And that's set to a level whereby a hard landing in an aircraft shouldn't trigger it, but a crash should. PLBs are designed for personal use by people in a range of environments. So whether you're backpacking, whether you're mountaineering, whether you might be boating, going out in a canoe or a kayak, on a snowmobile, skiing, any environment that you can think of where you might be going into a dangerous or a remote situation, then a PLB is useful for you as a person. And the difference is that really the PLB is something you carry with you.
When the customer goes out, they never expect them to be in a distress situation, whether it's maritime, land or sea. They don't expect that. But what they have that comfort knowing that if their vessel gets into trouble or crew members are getting into trouble, they know that they have a device which they can activate, and within a reasonable time frame, some sort of help will come to them. Some asset will come to them and pick them up.
When the beacons go off, we start the ball rolling that it's distressed. We'll make phone calls to the person that the beacon has been registered to, and then try to identify whether that person's actually in distress or not. Registration makes all the difference in us being able to quickly identify that there is actual distress out there. We find out that your loved one or whatever is out at sea, we'll respond immediately. It'll be much quicker getting assets on scene. If we can't get an identification that they are in distress, we'll automatically assume distress and start responding with assets.
Any distress beacon that's coded, whatever country you're from, the global system will work with those beacons. They've been type approved through a set of rigorous standards that the COSPAS-SARSAT program has established. And anywhere in the world that a distress beacon's picked up, if someone from the Russian Federation is in the United States and they're hiking in the Colorado Rockies and they go off, our Air Force RCCs will execute a rescue and save that person. And obviously, because it's a Russian Federation beacon, we would let the Russian Federation know, and vice versa.
Before, when the people from United Arab Emirates, when they go fishing, they don't have any idea about this COSPAS-SARSAT program. And when they had an incident, they trying to use the cell phones, and sometimes they low battery or there are no signals. So they maybe some of them took days to find them. But people now feel safe and secure and also protected. The time they activate this beacon, they know they are their people, they are watching them and they will come to help them.
Basically, the background on what distress beacons are, the different types, and how we use them. And by the way, the real heroes are the guys that go down those helicopter hoists and have to climb the mountains up and get those, rescue those people, which we call them SARTECs now. We used to call them pararescue. But they still do jump out of airplanes at times on parachutes to go in, and they're very highly qualified in medical treatment, because quite often before people can be evacuated out of an area, they need to be stabilized. If you get broken ribs and things like that, you can't just go dragging them down a mountainside. But anyway, search and rescue really hasn't changed before the satellites or afterwards, and the process is pretty much the same. The federal government handles missing aircraft and vessels that are in distress in federal waters. To do that, we've got 3 joint rescue coordination centers manned by Air Force and Coast Guard personnel, one in Victoria, one in Trenton, one in Halifax of the East Coast. And we also have 2 sub-centers, one in Quebec City to handle the St. Lawrence, and also one off Newfoundland, where there's also a high level of activity of maritime distress, enough to justify extra sites. Anything else in the country is primarily a local police problem. But they can call upon us for air resources if they need it to run a search. And the process is basically the same. Who's in trouble, who's reporting the event. This is very important, because if you don't find people alive, you need to know who the next of kin are. Is there any relationship? We've had times in rescue centers where people will deliberately put in a false case because they want to distract resources somewhere else from doing something illegal in another area. So we try to get as clear a picture of what we're up against before we start going. And then we want to know what we're looking for, where should we be looking, when did this happen, and why should we be starting a search now. Now, normally if it's an airplane that's gone missing and it's on a flight plan, the air traffic control will notify us. Now, with general aviation, a lot of people go off in visual flight plans. They go off hunting in remote lakes and float planes and things like that, and their flight plan says, I'm going to this lake, I'll be back in 2 weeks. So if anything happens in between, if you're waiting for the flight plan to alert them, you've got a problem. And the other question is that people in distress have to know where they are and how they communicated to the rescue people. So in the 1970s, we didn't have cell phones. Satellite communication was a primary push by a lot of the major parties, but it was mainly for long-distance communication. Inmarsat, the International Maritime Satellite Organization, put up geosynchronous satellites to handle communications with commercial ships in the oceans. But a lot of other communications, such as aircraft, we still used high-frequency radio. In fact, we're just transitioning to new technology, single sideband back then. And most of the communication that people were using, whether it's on vessels or light airplanes, was very high frequency VHF communications, which is basically line of sight. Now, there are problems of line of sight communication, and I'm sure as astronomers you can all figure the math out in this very easily, but basically, if you're on a ship that's got an antenna that's 10 meters above the deck or the water line, and you're looking for channel 16, which is the maritime distress frequency emergency beacon, you'll pick it up within about 10 kilometers. That's your line of sight. So if you're up in the middle of Lake Ontario, you'd have to have a lot of boats out there looking for you before somebody got close enough to pick up your channel 16 EPIRB. Similarly, in aviation, with the 120.5 megahertz ELTs, most general aviation flies below 10,000 feet, and quite often a lot lower. So you're looking at a maximum range of about 140 kilometers. High-flying jets, bigger range, above 30,000 meters, or sorry, that should be above 10,000 meters or 30,000 feet. Your range is about 360 kilometers. But the challenge with high-flying aircraft is they will pick the routes according to where the jet streams are up there, so they get the best fuel efficiency of making their trip, and all the planes will be going along the same route. So one area might be covered, but a whole vast other area will not be. monitor it at all. So the higher you go, put a satellite up at 100 kilometers, now you've got a range of about 1,200 kilometers, which is a significant increase. So the higher the altitude of the receiver, the greater the range of reception. Now, in the 1970s, GPS was undergoing development. It was used by the military. We had 300,000 aircraft in North America at the time, mostly general aviation, who flew visual flight rules. And otherwise, they may have an instrument that would point them at a beacon, so they would know what their approximate bearing was to a beacon and a time estimate based on the winds that they'd got before going away. It gives a primitive estimate of their location. Vessels is even more primitive. Sailors used celestial navigation techniques, and indeed the ocean racers that are going around the world these days, which, by the way, that's a rare commodity, the landing on the moon, they still maintain proficiency in celestial navigation. Smaller recreational vessels are much more primitive. They'll use dead reckoning techniques. For example, when we were living down on the East Coast, the lobster fishermen down there would put their traps out. Where are your traps? Well, I go to this heading at this engine RPM, which should give me this speed. And if the winds and the currents are right, I'll be there within X amount of time. So it's still a rough estimate of their location. Now, Laurent Sea was coming out around that time, which was more proficient, and some of the fishermen were quick to switch over to that. Although the reading may only be a line of position that they were getting, it was a very precise line of position. It would bring them back to the hot fishing spots that they found. But basically, if you're traveling in as an individual or remote area, you had nothing to back you up. So with the challenges that we had, I'll give you 3 different examples from my experience to sort of demonstrate the problem. The Hartwell search in 1972, he was going from Cambridge Bay down to Yellowknife. He was flying a medevac flight with a nurse, a patient, and the patient's mother on board. They went missing. He was out there for close to a month, and we found him. We found him on the mountain in the south shore of Great Bear Lake, 198 miles off track. Yeah, he was really lost. So it was a miracle that he survived. He survived because he was carrying a personal locator beacon at the time, and he knew because of the cold temperatures, limited battery life, it wouldn't last very long. So he saved it and didn't turn it on until he saw an airplane flying over. Well, it just so happened a couple of days before we found him, there was a military C-130 Hercules on a navigation training flight that was keeping up his navigation skills with grid flying and celestial techniques. Flew over the northern end of Great Bear Lake, and when the pilot saw him, he turned the ELT on briefly. We didn't find him, but it diverted the search area, which was going on mainly down in this area, diverted it up to this area. So we did find him and pulled him out. He survived. Other people around his airplane weren't quite so fortunate. We had another similar case in 1977, September, very much like September this month. An American had bought a sailboat that it was an old schooner that used to haul salt off Newfoundland. He's going to bring it back to New England and restore it. He and his grandson were on board the boat when the first hurricane of the season or one of the hurricanes of the season went through, and nothing was heard from them. In the maritime world at that time, if it was on a trip that would take 2 weeks, people would wait 2 weeks and maybe a bit longer before they'd report them missing. Unfortunately, in a case like that, if a boat capsizes somewhere in the middle like that and takes to a life raft with the oceans and the currents and the winds, the Gulf Stream and so on, our search area effectively was half the North Atlantic Ocean. Because of the drift of the object, you just don't know where he sank or where he went. So that's an almost impossible situation. We never did find a trace of that vessel. Another case was a personal one with some Inuit hunters around Christmas time of that year. They went out hunting in snowmobiles. The winter storm went through. They never returned. We brought an Inuit tracker in our airplane, and that was a good move because he could read the snow. The trail got partially wiped out because of the storm. and he could make some intuitive judgments as of what they would do when the trail was lost, which way they would go and so on, and it helped. And we followed the trail up to Narrow Canyon. It was dark and it was impossible to go in and check it out from the air, but we did call in the police. The local search party found their bodies frozen in that area. So without any way of getting accurate locations or signaling your distress when it happens, it caused searches to be lengthy, a lot of aircraft were involved, and it was expensive. And we've also knew from our statistics that the probability of survival diminished rapidly after 48 hours. Now, in Alaska, a plane went missing with 2 U.S. senators on board. Of course, that created a big hoopla, and the FAA immediately made the carriage of 121.5 ELTs mandatory in airplanes, and Canada followed suit in 1973. Of course, a lot of planes in Canada do go to the States or cross through American airspace, so if the Americans do it, you have to follow suit. So, we've now got distress beacons in all the airplanes, but then who's monitoring the distress frequency, and how do you narrow a search area down to get a better location? So, yes, we have volunteers in the picture too, like a lot of you are volunteers. Amateur radio started building satellites in the 1960s, and they were called Oscars, which is an orbiting satellite carrying amateur radios. Now, I had my ham radio license at the time too, and that was a challenging thing, we found out, because you'd be sitting there trying to send Morse code with one hand, and because of the Doppler shift in the signal, you'd have to keep tuning your radio with the other hand to keep track of the signal that you're listening to. So as a manual process, which we were in a primitive stage at that time, that was somewhat difficult. However, it did beg the question whether or not the Doppler shift could be used to determine where the transmitter is coming from. So Defense Research Establishment in Ottawa, the Communications Research Center, used the Oscar satellites to verify that this could be done. Excuse me, try to get my voice back here. So what we're basically doing is using the Doppler effect, and these are actual Doppler curves that were taken from one of our tracking stations. So we've got the time in seconds along one axis and the frequency of the signal on the other side. And you can see as the curve goes along, there's an inflection point in the curve, and the inflection point in the curve is the point where the satellite is passing a beam, the transmitter. Same thing, you don't hear it as much these days, but if you're at a railway crossing and a train is going by blowing its horn, you hear the high pitch, then abrupt change of the lower pitch. So the rate of change that you hear depends upon how close or how far you are away from the signal. So we have a lot of different signals showing up here, different ranges, different inflection points. The one up at the top here is probably a real good emergency transmitter because it was amplitude modulated. And you see 2 distinct sidebands that are paralleling the main signal. That is the ideal signal we would look for. But this sort of mismatch did cause some problems I'll talk about later. Anyway, at this point we know when we're abeam the signal, the shape of the curve, we know how far away it is, but we don't know which side it is. We were hoping that the rotation of the Earth would cause enough distortion of the Doppler curve that we could just sort that out. So that was part of our research phase of the project. So Project SARSAT started after the Oscar satellite experiments proved the concept. Canada was interested, the United States and France were interested. You wonder why France is interested. France has a lot of overseas territories, so they have a particular interest in the global aspect of the project. Also, France had developed some digital beacons they were experimenting with to collect weather buoy data in the oceans around the world, and that was proving to be promising, and they were adapting that technology to the emergency position indicating radio beacons. So the long and the short was Canada provided the receivers for 121.5, 243 and 406 megahertz distress frequencies and a downlink transmitter. France provided some onboard processors for the 406 beacons. The USA provided the satellites. That was done via NOAA using their weather satellites. Now, the problem was doing those calculations manually, such as you saw in the previous Doppler slide, takes a lot of time, and that it's not good in a search and rescue environment. So we had a challenge. How do you build a fast processor to handle these Doppler signals and quickly get the locations calculated and put it out? Well, you write a good specification, hire a team of brilliant engineers, pay them well, reward them with success. This is one of the engineers who was working on that side of the project. And you can see his reward is a T-shirt with an animated picture of an ELT on it. Anyway, he's grinning, so I think there's a bottle of scotch went with it. Single malt. Anyway, at the same time, the US and Russia had a lot of cooperative technical agreements. And if you go to Moscow, it is interesting to go to their space museum, because when I was there in 1982, they did have exhibits of both Western and Soviet Union technology, because they did have link-ups in space and programs working together. Of course, that all fell by the wayside after the MOU was signed with us in 1979. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and things went downhill. We were one of only 2 projects between the East and West that was kept going after that. The other was an icebreaker policy. So the gist of the MOU was satellites would be interoperable. After launch, we'd have 18 months of field testing, and it was up to every country to develop its own technology. That phase was called a demonstration and evaluation, or D&E phase. A Communications Research Center did the satellite testing, and then field tests, training of people in the field and so on, was done by D&D, and that was really my job, is handling all this stuff on the bottom part of the slide. They were looking for somebody with background in computers and operational experience in search and rescue. So the basic concept is shown here. You heard about these terms, ELT, EPIRBs, ELTs, in the early movie. This is a depiction of the NOAA weather satellite. This is a depiction of the Russian Cosmos-1 satellites. They received the signals, sent them down to a tracking station. The tracking station did the Doppler calculations on the locations. They were under control of the Mission Control Center. And they also did the data distribution to rescue coordination centers, to the search and rescue people who brought those pararescue out to do the rescue of the survivors. So that's basically the way the concept of the system works. Now, in the summer of 1982, in Canada, we had completed the installation and testing of the LUTs and the CMCC. We'd done our field test planning. We'd briefed all our RCCs across the country in North America, search and rescue squadrons. We set up cross-border lines of communication because, for example, if we put an ELT on here near Toronto, it'd be a plane maybe taking off out of Buffalo or Rochester heading to New York, would pick it up and it'd get reported to another RCC in the States and cause a lot of consternation that was unnecessary. So we did a lot of coordination to minimize interference of test activities with the real world. Unfortunately, SARSAT was delayed in launch due to onboard interference of another instrument that was put on the weather satellite. So to eliminate that interference, we had to delay our launch. The SARSAT project was supposed to go first, but we gave the Russians the go-ahead, and they launched in June, followed by a 2-month checkout of their satellite, and made the downlink available to us on September 1st. During that same period of time, an airplane went missing in BC. We searched for it for 4 weeks. No trace of the aircraft was ever found, and the search was terminated. About 1,800 hours were flown. The cost was $9 million. So the pilot's father chartered an airplane to continue the search. Incidentally, the whole initial research phase that I was involved in and I'm talking about here was budgeted for $10 million, and it came in under budget. So we're looking at one search costing about as much money as this whole project did. Mr. Ziegelheim is a pilot from Brampton who was hired to continue the search by Mr. Ziegelheim. They're caught in bad weather, crashed in the mountains. Initial search was carried out with no results. The ALT was damaged, but the pilots did recover it and managed to bucksheet get an antenna connected back up to it and activated it. That was picked up by the COSPAS satellite. That was right at our extreme limits of coverage at that time, but it was great because we were able to launch a search plane. They found it. He was about 60 miles from where they were looking because they ended up in the wrong valley in the mountains. Sartex parachuted in. The pilot had serious injuries, was bleeding badly, and probably would have died if that hadn't been a timely rescue. So this is a picture of the official crash. And you might note in the early project, you see the logo is different than the ones that I'm handing out here tonight. It says SARSAT, COSPAS, and the Cyrillic characters. The reason was that we were supposed to be first. You'll see later on that the logos changed. Oh, I should mention, well, when the use of the downlink was turned over to us, I was talking to our people in Ottawa saying, what is your public relations plan? Because we have regular distresses and we're going to find something. And they said, there is no plan. Keep your mouth shut until we have the official opening with the minister. I said, when will that be? That'll be January. I said, you're crazy. And it turns out the press did find out. They did call us because when you get into professional magazines such as Aviation Week and Space Technology, they know all the contracts that are going on. They know exactly what state they're at. They know who the people are to call. And there's no fooling them. So anyway, the cat was out of the bag. But eventually we did have our official opening. And the good guy on the left was me, much younger version of me. And that's the Minister of Defense, Gilles Lamontagne, at the time, and Minister of Communications, Francis Fox. And General Manson was our Chief Air Force representative at the time. I should mention this relationship and the project was unique when we started it up because to deal with NASA at the time, the Americans had a rule saying no foreign military could deal with NASA. So even though D&D had the primary responsibility for search and rescue in Canada, Communications Research Center was made the point of contact, the official point of contact for this project. Number of good suppliers. Canadian Astronautics Limited, the tracking station, and that fellow I showed you before, the engineer who got the nice reward, was one of the people who helped develop that. SED Systems, which is a product of the University of Saskatoon at the time, they did the CMCC. Spar Aerospace did the satellite components. Bristol Aerospace built the first 406 ELTs. And by the way, they're based in Winnipeg, and they did a very good job of building that. I think we had the best 406 beacon of any country in the early days of the project. But during the demonstration, we had put live beacons out to show how well the system worked for the minister, and one of them was placed in his riding. We didn't get it on the satellite pass. It turned out January in Quebec City can be very cold, and it was a cold and windy day. And the young cadet we sent out to put the beacon out, put along the side of a road and went inside to warm up. Of course, Murphy strikes. A snow plow comes along, and no beacon. Anyway, we did press on, continue with the D&E as well with our official field testing and technical testing. And these results were reported in a symposium that was held in Toulouse in 1984. And all the details from that time period can be found in this book, which was put out by CNES which was the French Centre National des Études Spéciales, which I think now is part of the European Satellite Project. By the way, we, just for interest, we're expecting theoretically the results, we'd be able to locate ELTs within 20 kilometers. Technical tests said we could, but the real world tests weren't quite as good. We're getting 27 kilometers for 1 sigma error. So 2 times out of 3 we'd be within that distance. Now that is a big help in narrowing down a search area. But we didn't do very well in the ambiguity resolution. It remained at the 50% level. So we also worked with the 406 experimental beacons. They were digital. They put out a pulse for half a second once every 50 seconds. So that would allow the batteries to last without going dead quickly, especially when you're using them in very cold weather. So we had them spec to run for 48 hours at minus 20 centigrade. It did give us much better accuracy. We're getting 95% within 5 kilometers. And we also found that they were geosynchronous compatible. We did an interesting experiment. When this went up, the Americans stretched one of the receivers so we could pick up a bit of the 406 band. And we built a geosynchronous satellite receiver to monitor it in Ottawa. The French were putting a demonstration of their polar orbiting system over off the coast of France. And that was just right on the fringe of the geosynchronous satellite over the Atlantic. Well, it turned out the French put an EPIRB on the airplane that must have come from an airplane because it had a G-switch in it. And they bought an old derelict of a ship. They put a bomb on it to blow the hull out, and they're waiting for it to sink and at all times, so it takes so long for the boat to sink. Then the low Earth orbit satellite would come over, pick up the ELT, and send the location to the French Mission Control Center. Well, as soon as the charges went off in the ship, we picked it up in Ottawa on our primitive or geosynchronous satellite detector. So we kind of spoiled the show over in France by getting the alert out to them before the boat actually sank. Anyway. But one of the unique things with 406 beacon is that they have a unique identification in them, and it helps us answer the questions who it is and what it is. So the superiority of this technology was quite evident. Now, even though we were doing field tests and so on, and technical tests, it was really the real world activities that dominated the events and cases in this period. We had 190 distress cases, and 90% of them were caused by inadvertent activations. Signal processing problems caused 10 times as many alerts. And you saw in that earlier Doppler slide, there might have been 4 or 5 distinct or possible ELTs in that dot plot that I showed you, but they're not all distress beacons anyway. But on the distress, the real distress, we did have some excellent results that got a lot of attention. 18% of the cases, that's 1 out of 5. The satellite was the only source of alert. That meant that somebody got into trouble and nobody knew where they were in trouble until we found them and rescued them. In another 23% of the cases, we knew people were in trouble, and the satellite was the first source of alert. So we're still beating the timeline. And of course, another 24%, the alert came in from another source before the satellite found them. Now, during most of this D&E problem, because of the problems we had with the original SARSAT satellite, we're working with only one satellite, the Russian satellite, so there'd be long gaps in the coverage. We did eventually, I think, get up to 3 during the D&E phase. So these are examples of the real incidences that got attention, and this is where our rescue people are really challenged, where they have to climb up that glacier get inside that airplane and get the people out safely and down off the glacier. But we did have a lot of spectacular cases. But we also discovered a lot of new problems. ELT didn't work when the airplane crashed. Some of it's a design problem. Now, one of them, say, using this box as an example, hope I don't squash your metal case. You have a ELT where the battery's in this part of the case and the circuit board is sitting in the front here. G-switch is lined up so the direction of flight is this way. So when the airplane crashes immediately, the whole plane will stop, this will stop. But a battery has a lot of momentum, and if it wasn't properly mounted or shielded inside that structure, it would accelerate into the circuit board and crack it, and of course the ELT wouldn't work. That was one example we found. Another problem is that these things, if they're mounted at a convenient place for maintenance or whatever in the airplane, they'll have a cable that runs out to an antenna somewhere else. You saw the one picture in the earlier video of a crash site where the plane is split just before the tail. Well, with that type of construction, those cables will break. So a smart pilot, if they survive and know all about it, this will go and take the ELTs out and put a manual antenna on and use it. But it was a problem. And of course, a lot of planes, if they're working it onto uncontrolled airstrips, no one's monitoring 125 megahertz. They have a band landing, the ELT in their airplane goes off, nobody's listening, the battery goes dead. So when they run into a real problem, the only thing wrong with the beacon is that the battery's dead. We also found that satellites were affected by ground-based interference. This could be a challenge at times because with a transmitter in an air traffic control station, the signal is very powerful, very stable, and the location is very precise. We knew exactly what was going on when these showed up. So we'd call them up and say, could you check your transmitter? We think it's stuck on. Well, in radios where you're working one frequency for both receiving and transmitting, the way the equipment's normally set up, you push the talk button and it shuts the receiver off so the transmit signal doesn't overload the receiver. So naturally, if the transmitter's stuck on, if they go to turn the receiver on, they'll hear nothing because they can't turn it on. So there was a bit of an education process that we had to go through in sorting out a few of these problems. Now, the main problem where we did very well on location with the technical tests, but not on the real tests, was because of ELT frequency and stability. These are crystal controlled devices that usually multiply the frequency up several times to get to the 121.5 megahertz band. And with subtle temperature changes, such as airplane coming from a cold altitude, landing at a warm ground below, or vice versa, it's flying up high with the heaters on and lands in the cold area down below, the temperature changes are going to cause the oscillator to shift in frequency because there was no built-in frequency stability and wasn't required in the specifications for those early distress beacons. Another problem why we had so many false signals was some of the beacons would be over-modulated. And because they're over-modulated, you just get a blast of noise all over, and the Doppler processor is trying to say which of these points match up. They don't necessarily make sense, so you end up with maybe a dozen locations where you only needed one. So that was putting a lot of stress on our rescue coordination centers because we're running about 60 incidents a month. We also had problems we found with EPIRBs. Now, as soon as people started hearing about the satellites and the success we had with airplanes, nobody wanted to work on the 156 megahertz marine beacons, the EPIRBs. They went out and started buying ones that worked at 121.5 megahertz. Well, here's one of the ones that was rushed out to the market by a manufacturer. Worked well on a bench, worked in a bucket of water, went undetected and placed in the lake. Now, one of the guys working with another ham radio operator, and he said, I'm going to take it apart and look at it. We looked at it, and there's no ground plane underneath the antenna. So all the signal was going into the lake. It was a bad design. So it was obviously that we had to do some work on improving things to make satellite distress alerting a success. Now, that was a bit of a challenge because some of these responsibilities go back to another department, the Ministry of Transport, which was not involved in this project. Anyway, we did do some research for the D&E as to what these causes were. Parked aircraft, no apparent reason. Could be an airplane was jostled when it was being moved. Could have been the pilot at a bad landing. Maintenance, people connect up wires incorrectly or hit a switch and don't notice it. Weather was a big factor. A severe turbulence would cause beacons to go off. Poor operating procedures. The standard procedures pilots normally do or were supposed to do at the time. You're allowed to test your ELT at the first 5 minutes of the hour to see if it's working. And then after landing, you're supposed to turn the radio to the distress frequency to make sure you didn't have a bad landing. It wasn't transmitting. Well, very few people after they landed had any interest in checking the radio. So we had a lot of beacons that were going off that shouldn't have been, and nobody was hearing them. And we did have a few just mistering things. Don't know what they are. The non-ELTs, by the way, we found computers were coming in and were picking up computer modems that were radiating on the distress frequency. And we had other unusual non-distress beacons. Takes 4G, as you saw in the earlier video, to set off a G switch. And it was not uncommon to find these located in the post office. So you know how your packages are being handled. Sometimes they're accidentally turned on by people who are inquisitive. The person takes it home, the pilot takes it home, and the kids pick it up. What's the switch for? And they turn it on. I mentioned the pre-flight, post-flight checks not being done properly. We actually found one on the top of an apartment building in downtown Ottawa. I guess a thief had stolen the pilot's briefcase that had an ELT in it. While he's sitting up on the top roof of this apartment building going through the loot, he saw this mysterious radio and he was wondering what it was and turned it on. And led us right to him. Anyway, and then we had some real surprise cases. We had an aircraft that was abandoned right here within the confines of metropolitan Toronto that had been abandoned by drug smugglers. That was a tough one to take down because the registration had been changed so many times over the months. It took a long time, but eventually they did catch up with some of the people who were behind that smuggling operation. And of course, the other problem we're finding in the ocean areas was beacons are being shipped, but they're falling off the vessels while they were being shipped. They weren't mounted properly, so there are some mount issues that had to be worked out for the maritime world. So basically, the real world activities helped push the project forward. I mentioned the SARS Eagleheim, and shortly after that, we had catamaran was overturned. I think it was 300 kilometers off the east coast in American waters. That was rough weather, rough search, but they still hurricane season. But they did bring a big freighter in to block the water so another smaller rescue boat could go in and pull the survivors off. And we had another crash in Quebec around that time, and that was interesting because my boss at that time in Trenton, who ran the RCCs in the country, General Dave Garland, he was, by the way, one of the people in the chase pilot with the Avro Arrow while it was being tested before that project got scrapped. So he's no stranger to research, but on this particular day we heard the overflights. It was late in the afternoon. We knew it was going to get dark soon. It was obviously the way the airplanes were flying that day. It was a more remote part of Quebec. And he said, we got to get somebody out there. So he said, launch the squadron. He said, where do you go to? Just head for Quebec. We got a satellite pass coming up. We'll give you the coordinates after you're airborne. And sure enough, we did. They got there, found an airplane crashed. 2 people on board, unfortunately. The one person in the airplane died because of his injuries, but we were able to get a helicopter out of our base in Bagotville and get the other pilot rescued and off for medical help before it got dark. Now, at the same time, our French colleagues and their partners also had a good success in missing sailors off the Canary Islands in the South Atlantic. So it was things like this that showed the merits of the system. Sailors like that off the Canaries were probably following the traditional route that sailors do to get over to North America to go to the Caribbean. So they would have been more than a month before they would have been reported overdue if they didn't show up. And of course, one of the big cases we had happened on 23rd of June 1985. Pass were tracking over the Western Atlantic, produced 2 locations, one in Canada, one near the UK. RCF Plymouth had heard reports of an ELT, and they sent an airplane out to investigate the locations which we got from the satellite, which was just off the Irish coast. That was Canada's worst terrorist act. 329 people killed on an Air India Flight 182 from Toronto to Bombay. This crash was discovered before the flight was officially reported overdue. Now, we had people from ICAO attending some of our meetings at that time, and it was incidents like this that really caught their attention. And we obviously had, if we wanted to make it international, we had to do more than what we were doing as a research project. So we had a number of serious policy issues to see. Satellites see beyond borders. We had pretty good working relationships in North America with Americans, the Danes, and of course the UK and the Portuguese to the east. But the French had a particular problem because of the smallness of Europe and so many countries. A lot of them are still behind the Iron Curtain at the time, and there were no communications channels, no agreements. So how do we modify our rules to make sure that the notifications go to the right people who are going to be responsible and take action? So we had a lot of work on the operational side and political side to get that resolved. The carriage issues, we had more and more people bringing the beacons with them. We had one person from the UK who liked to try to ski to the North Pole. He'd sort of go around, ski around till his supplies got low, then he'd turn a beacon on to have people come and rescue him. So we had to sort out policy and carriage issues and technical issues. I mentioned a lot of those the problems we found with the ELTs before. We had to get those covered. If we're going to be an international global system, our system was what we call real-time coverage. We had to see the satellite while the satellite saw the distress beacon. Now, we didn't have a lot of satellites at that time. We didn't have a lot of tracking stations that would give us that mutual visibility. So we had a lot of work to do to try to expand the program internationally. The USA and Russia carried a lot of weight in the International Maritime Organization meetings because the voting power was based on the size of your fleets. And they had the biggest fleets, with help from the Norwegians and a few others that were working with us at that stage. We worked closely with the International Civil Aviation Organization, and I think it's Bjorn Gaustad, who is the head of air traffic controls, rules of the air search and rescue, and so on at their headquarters, was coming to our meetings, and he was a very good mentor that helped me along. So he wanted me to help produce a bulletin that could go around to all the leaders around the world to explain the issues that we had to deal with in order to progress with this system and gain international acceptance. So I produced ICAO Circular 185, which had to be illustrated, and I had some good illustration help because I'm a lousy artist, from Betty Reed here, who did the drawings for this brochure that went around to all the countries. And that got the ball rolling. I subsequently got invited to meetings and regional ICAO meetings in South America and the Far East to help support the cause. So we began working on global operations. We needed a new MOU. The original MOU was only for a research project. The research phase was over. It was obviously this is going to be an operational success, so a new MOU was signed so we could continue work on it. We held the first meeting in Seattle in 1985. It was just after the Air India incident. And new participants were coming to join us at the table. Obviously 406 was good, but we had to come up with some coding standards for that. And it's sort of like going to a Chinese buffet of you got a whole bunch of things to pick from. Now, how are you going to pick what's good for you and what really need and what you work? We knew for sure we needed to get a country code into the beacon and some standardized way of doing that, but there's a lot of identification information. Now, one of the engineers that I have a lot of respect for worked with NASA. Well, everybody's arguing about this. The French would say we want this, the Danes would say we want this, and somebody else would say they want that. And we said, look, set up a computerized database. I mean, IBM had just come out with its PCs. It was a doable thing without a lot of effort. And then you can put all the information you want in there, and you just need a unique code to identify the user. So, for the most part, that's what we did. ICAO and IMO still made a couple of exceptions under the Global Maritime Distress and Safety System where they want a particular digit put in there. But I think you'll see at the end of the slide that the PLB concept and database really caught off because I think half the beacons of the world fall into that category. So, just to keep things going here. So I guess the bottom line here is that if you want to take your telescope and go up to a remote mountain in the Andes where you can get a better view of the sky and the stars for your observing, just to be on the safe side, get a 406 beacon and register to bring it along with you. So while you're down here looking up there, we'd be down looking out for you. Anyway, there's a lot of rapid development after that. We did gain international acceptance within ICAO and the Global Maritime Distress and Safety Systems. We originally were hosted at Inmarsat, but they went private, so we had to find a new host, and ICAO was very accommodating and a lot less expensive to set up operation in Montreal than it was in London, England. So we moved there, and this eventually led to, because of the problems with the 125 megahertz ELTs, led to a cessation of processing those signals in 2009. That by the time that happened, we had almost 1 million 406 beacons working. And the project worked from the LEO satellites that we approved, the geosynchronous satellites, to using MEOSAR satellites. They're using time delay technology, amongst other things for that work. And that work is continuing today, but that's very close to becoming a reality. This is a chart of incidents. That's the last official one reported internationally up to the end of December 2017. And you'll notice that there are a lot of people using PLBs for both the land aviation and marine, because you can buy 406 PLB for about $500. It can be used in all those environments right now. The only difference is it won't meet MOT standards because it doesn't have a G switch in it for aviation. It will be float free and possibly water activated, but not automatic. And of course, ELTs are in use. They're not fully in use Canada yet. I see that our Minister, Mark Garneau, has recently put out a notice trying to make 406 mandatory. Canada was very slow in following suit with the change in the ICAO rules. But you can see from all the yellow dots, which are the ELTs, that a lot of people who are working in remote areas in Canada have got the smarts to make sure they're using 406 when they go there. You see much greater acceptance in Europe with a lot of 406 activity. And of course, EPIRBs are all over the place, as you can see. These are the traditional routes that boats take across the North Atlantic, and a lot are used in Australia, New Zealand, and South Pacific. Unfortunately, the colors don't show up as well as they could in this picture to really distinguish between some of the PLBs and the other ELTs and EPIRBs. And this is when you really get to feel old, and that's when you're put in a museum.
Tonight we honor two outstanding new technologies by inducting them into the Hall of Fame. They are the COSPAS-SARSAT satellite rescue and NeuroArm Simbus robotic surgical technologies that are already saving and improving lives here on Earth. The following video will give us an overview of this revered program, now in its 26th year, and will illustrate just why these two technologies are being inducted here tonight. Please enjoy the video.
Look at the things that have happened in the last 50 years. What are some of the greatest achievements of the last century? And a lot of them have to do with space. And the technology required for us to explore has found other uses here on Earth. So a lot of the technological achievements of the last 50 years are as a result of the money we spent trying to send people to the moon and send people out into space.
The knowledge, skills, and technologies developed to get us out there serve us well here on Earth. From modest conveniences to life-saving devices, space technology is an essential part of our lives, with literally astronomical returns on our investment. In medicine, transportation, communications, computer science, biology, aerospace, public safety, energy, agriculture, quality of life.
I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, tremendous technical developments, far outweighing what we have spent on the space program. But to me, these things are secondary. I mean, this is a bonus. It's the thing itself that's so remarkable, the knowledge that we've gained about the universe.
Exploring the vastness of space demands innovative, new technologies. The journey continues to expand our abilities far beyond what many believed possible.
When you innovate, as you advance a space frontier, you create a culture of innovation in the nation that funds it. Other people say, hey, that's a really cool thing to do. I want to become an engineer too. I want to become a scientist just like you. And they start doing innovative things, whether or not it has to do with space.
The Space Technology Hall of Fame honors those who transform technologies originally developed for space exploration into the products and services that improve the quality of our lives on Earth. COSPAS-SARSAT. In 1979, the United States, France, Canada, and the Soviet Union agreed to jointly develop a worldwide satellite-based search and rescue system. By 1985, that system, known as COSPAS-SARSAT, was fully operational. The first generation used low Earth orbit satellites to detect emergency signals and repeat them to ground stations where Doppler processing provided signal location. To improve signal location accuracy, NASA led an effort to incorporate search and rescue instruments on GPS satellites in mid-Earth orbit. This new distress alerting satellite system embedded the GPS location in the signal itself, eliminating Doppler calculation for faster ID and rescue. Today, more than 40 countries participate in COSPAS-SARSAT, making this a truly international effort. Since its inception, it has provided response to the over 1 million beacons in use worldwide and helped rescue more than 32,000 people. COSPAS-SARSAT, space technology saving lives on Earth.
By the way, there are tens of thousands of those shipping containers floating around in the oceans around this world, and they are a real hazard. There was a movie made about that, which I tried to show to my wife, but she wouldn't watch it. Robert Redford, where his boat hits one of those things, and he's trying to patch fiberglass in a wet ocean under difficult conditions. Very little conversation in it, practically none. But it's intriguing, and those are some of the things which we're up against where this system like this helps. Well, we did have competition, I should mention at the time. The Germans were working, I believe, on an L-band system, with frequency of your cell phones, working through the Inmarsat satellites, which are geosynchronous. And they had some of that technology on display at our symposium in Toulouse. But from a practical point, I went and looked at it, and I couldn't help but break out laughing. Now, you saw the pictures of the boats out there bouncing around in the waves. Can you imagine a person who's got a beacon that's about the size of this podium over here that's floating around in the ocean? You're in your life raft or lifeboat, and you got to get from the waves over to that beacon, because either you have to connect up some wires to it to make it work and send out your distress, or you have to get there and stand beside it on the keyboard and try to type your distress message into it. I mean, the engineering behind it to work in the L-band and get to the satellites was brilliant, but the practical implementation was headed to disaster, and they eventually did drop that project in the late 1980s. So to wrap things up, after 20 years after we started this project, those of us who were the early pioneers working that all got recognized by the National SAR Secretariat and half of the government for the work that we did. And the last case was very interesting that was mentioned when I was being introduced. We had an American who bought a big new powerboat, went over to the Bahamas. It was in early June, and the first hurricane of the season was coming through. Well, he decided he's going to make a dash back to Florida and beat the hurricane. He didn't. He had one of the new 406 beacons, but he hadn't registered it. And of course, the Coast Guard kept getting all these locations, and they had some problems with their processing algorithms in the MCC there in the states that were misleading. Now, in an RCC, when a hurricane goes through, they get very busy, especially down in Florida. So they keep sending an airplane out to whatever last location they got, and nothing was there. So they called for help. Because I worked in the demonstration evaluation part of the project, and I was very familiar with all the processing algorithms and some of the byproducts of those algorithms, I was able to take a data dump from the satellite, sort the locations out, come up with some merge locations from each satellite pass, discard the bad ones, keep the good ones, and come up with a progressive drift plot, which I used and passed on to the Coast Guard and said, if you want to find this EPIRB, go here. And they did, and pulled two people over clinging to the boat in the water. And so it was a real payoff to having gone through the research phase of the project and had a little bit more detailed insight into what is behind all the signal processing and how it can be used. Now, getting the programmers to do it and do it correctly was another challenge. But when you're working people your environment is doing this and their environment is doing that, pulling it together and make it work does make for an interesting challenge. So that pretty well wraps up my presentation. As I said, if you're going to go off to a mountaintop and do some more stuff, you can get yourself a 406. If you want more information, there's a lot of aspects to this project. The political, technical, the operational, they're very well detailed in this book that was just recently released. I don't have an ISBN number to give to you. I could probably write the guy. I know all the people who have produced this report, and I've worked with them all in the past, and they're all top-notch people, and it is a top-notch report. And there's a lot more depth. I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg here. And again, keep us busy.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I'm here. Yeah. First of all, a little question that's personal. I used to live in Iqaluit, and I'm just wondering what year it was that those hunters were discovered, and unfortunately they didn't survive.
December 1977.
Okay. Anyway, this summer I was sailing in Georgian Bay, and when I was in the Arctic, I also was by myself for 2 days in a blizzard at the west end of Baffin Island. And I'm just curious to know if I'd had that safety equipment or needed to use it, how long would it take for each place for people now to realize, A, somebody was in trouble, and B, roughly where they were so they could start launching airplanes, and C, close enough to be able to say it's probably within this maybe 20 kilometer area?
Well, with the new 406, is my microphone coming through? Okay, with the new 406 technology, the accuracy that were recorded in the DNA phase was 5 kilometers. In actual fact, we do better with that, and on Doppler processed signals, we actually merge them together to get a more accurate location. That's part of the processing that goes on at the MCC. We couldn't get quite as much accuracy in the early GPS or location encoded beacons because they didn't have enough bits to give the precision that was required for being really precise. So that's why we do additional processing at the MCC level to get the location down. So normally I think you'd be looking at somewhere of having you down within maybe a kilometer. Now, the big question is where do the resources come from? The RCCs have the authority to go, for example, if they know somebody is running a helicopter operation up in your area or as some other commercial operation up there that's nearby you, they can charter them to go out. But if it is remote and there's nothing around there, then we have to get the helicopters up there. When I was in search and rescue, that would be a challenge because our Voyagers that we had at the time, Labrador Voyagers, the same thing, one was Army, one was an Air Force helicopter, had limited range, and it took a lot of fuel hops with fuel caches on the route to get them up there. The new helicopters that we have do have a greater range, but I hear they're not quite as reliable, so and they're more expensive to run. But we do have the option of bringing out other resources, and of course our search airplanes all carry the pararescue people on board, so they will quite often go over site, for example, and parachute a radio down to you, get more details. Are you okay? Are you injured? And so on. Do you need any food? And depending upon the nature of the discussions, actions will ensue. If you're injured, they may very well parachute you down, start giving you medical attention while we're waiting for a helicopter or a plane on floats or skis or whatever to come in and help you out.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk, Major. Very much appreciate it.
SARSAT is actually a system, right? Yes. So how many satellites are in the actual system?
I counted up the other day and I forgot the numbers, but we do have, I think we've got 4 geosynchronous satellites in geosynchronous orbit. And we have, I think we're running 4 LEO satellites at all times. And I know that the MEO is just in that transition phase between being a test facility and an operational facility. So I'm not sure exactly. I know that those are going up like wildfire, those satellites. I'm not sure exactly how many are in orbit at this time.
More envisioned?
Yes, that's part of why we have these long-range agreements signed off by our governments. Now, when we started out, we're just 4 countries. I think the Norwegians were quick to come in and build their own tracking station fairly early in the project. We had some participation from Brazil early in the project. And then I think Singapore came online shortly after my visit there. I think that was about 1986, 87. And it's just sort of growing. And I think the last meeting that we held, the number of countries participating in this project was 80. 80 different nations are participating in it. Now, the latest satellite status are published or available in the regular reports from the international COSPAS-SARSAT organization headquartered in Montreal. And if you go to the website COSPAS-SARSAT.int, you'll find in there some of the more additional reports. I think I have some additional slides here, but I don't think I got the current satellite information in it. I think since the program started up, the number of people who've been assisted by the satellites and rescues count is up to 46,000.
Okay, thank you.
If you talk, Major, two things I wanted to ask. With the change to 4.6 megahertz, does the frequency, how is it that the frequency may give you better positioning? Does it make it easier to do the curve fitting necessary as opposed to 121.5? And the other question I was hoping to ask is if there's any talk of including ADSP data in the future. Thank you.
Yes, the key behind the 406 beacon is the stability requirements. We have very tight stability requirements of the oscillator once the beacon is turned on. And that's why we could get some good results with some of our technical tests when we're using very precisely controlled oscillators as opposed to just a regular ELT. Now, I'm sorry, the ADSP, I did remember something on that, but sorry, my memory isn't as good as it should be. Yes, we've got a question in the back.
Is it on? Yes. It's very interesting when I see that it's when the video says, you know, all you have to do is buy one of these beacons and everything else is free. How does the funding work? You know, and so much of, say, the Pacific Ocean isn't really anyone's territory, so the someone's paying for you to watch in not even national territory.
Yes, in oceanic regions, this is very interesting because we get 3-mile limits, 12-mile limits, 100-mile limits, and so on, different boundaries where different levels of jurisdiction apply, whether it's a crime, whether it's fishing, or whether it's other activities. So it is a little bit more complex, but what people in rescue coordination centers normally do is that they will try to alert vessels in the area around you, if you're out in the middle of the Pacific, to go and help out or investigate the distress signals they're picking up. And I think that's one of the keys in this organization. In fact, it was rather interesting at one of our meetings because under the days of the Soviet Union, the Americans went into a meeting saying, well, here's our area of responsibility. And they showed the whole Pacific Ocean up to 12 miles off the Russian coast of Kamchatka. Of course, that got a bit of a reaction. So the next meeting, Russians came up and they showed charts. No, this is our area of responsibility in the Pacific. And they had it up to 12 miles off the coast of California. So, yeah, that's where we had to get together and come up with something. And I was at that meeting and I said, hey, both you guys got it right. Because if there's a distress out there, and you think that's your area, we sent it to us, and you think it's our area, sent vice versa. I said, at least you got 2 people responding, which is better than having nobody. So then we started to make progress doing this properly.
Yeah. What about people carrying laser pointers? Because, as you know, you shouldn't be using them because of aircraft, but if you've got a powerful enough one, it really goes quite a distance, right? I mean, if it's hooked up with those 406s, that could make it much more precise in terms of accuracy, right? in terms of locating somebody?
I would think with the narrowness of the beam width, that would be a very difficult thing to detect.
Well, yeah. But it's viewable. I mean, these things can go, 100 miles if you've got one that's
I know that's
strong
the problem
enough.
with aviation, because pilots are having problems and getting blinded and approached to airports.
I understand it might be a
people are doing
problem. And what about looking forward with Facebook and Google and all these other companies putting in these thousands of satellites they're going to be putting up in the next 2 years? Is a 406 access going to be built into those satellites, those nano satellites? I don't know. I'm asking.
Yes, it's possible. I don't know all the platforms that they're planning and putting the MEO technology on.
But that would be really useful.
By the way, just as an aside, you noticed one of the slides that I did earlier talking about the range of communications. It was all in meters. Well, towards later stages of the project, after the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse, we had a meeting in St. Petersburg. It was still called Leningrad then, where I met our counterparts in Russia that were doing the work on the field testing and so on. And one of them turned to her handler and said, "I've got a really important question, may I ask the Canadians?" And he gave him the go-ahead. And she said, "When we go out and do all our tests, we do it in nautical miles. Why do we have to convert it to metric?" I said, "We do exactly the same thing, and it's because the people who want the international reports all want it in metric. So, like it or not, we have to sit down and do the conversions for them." Because anyone who's an astronomer would know that 1 minute of radius on the Earth is 1 nautical mile, and that's how navigation works.
I've heard a number of references to mid-Earth geosync satellites. Do you start losing accuracy when a signal is transmitted, like say at the North Pole?
I don't believe so, and I haven't seen the results of the MEO satellite testing, but they're doing a lot of time delay synchronization. I remember that was talked about a lot in our early phases of the project, but it's now being followed up by the people who are currently working it. And there are some other technologies. For example, one of my colleagues that I knew is a sailboat similar to mine, sails up in Lake Superior, which is fairly remote. He was a former FAA Airlines inspector. He always carried the spot system that the French produced, and it had the advantage that you paid an annual fee for it. But when you're going out in your boat, it would send messages through the satellite to a point in the internet where somebody could actually dial up and follow you. So he would arrange for some of us to follow him. So we knew where he was going and where he was stopped or where he was last at. And the RCCs will respond to information requests that come through other sources like that. But it depends upon a particular individual having access to the internet and doing the checks for you. Whereas with something like 406, the alerting is automatic.
I have a quick question. You've described this thing as a global enterprise very clearly. What is the participation of China and some of the other Southeast Asian countries? You mentioned one that being Singapore came on board, but you've no mention of any others.
Yes, China just came on board, started coming to our meetings about the time I left the project, which was 1991. But they've been active participants since then, and they've put their own tracking systems there. Before that, we had one in Hong Kong before Hong Kong separated and became part of China. So there's still 2 projects within the Chinese sphere of influence right now.
Yes, I'm just curious. So you mentioned the price of the personal item that you can use. So where would you go about getting one?
I'd go to any outdoor shop, or you can go to marine stores and find them. Certain people that provide things for airplanes, they're going to be carrying the official versions approved by MOT Canada with the G switches and so on in them. You may have noticed on one of these last slides here that there are a lot of PLBs in use for both aviation, land, and marine. And I should point out one other difference, which you will note here. I've got some stickers left over from the project days, but when you saw the early stickers that said SARSAT COSPAS with COSPAS in Cyrillics, it's now that the Soviet Union is over the project name as COSPAS-SARSAT. It says Russia, not the Soviet Union, on the label. So there have been some subtle changes over time.
Well, as I understand it, this is an emergency, indicates that there is an emergency of some kind. Outside of the location and the registered owner, is there much more information that's communicated once the beacon is activated? Can you, for instance, indicate the nature of your emergency? How
Yes.
does that get passed to the people that are searching?
Yeah, that's partially covered in the type certification documentation for the beacons. If it's encoded as an aviation beacon, you would expect that the G switch would have been activated to cause it, the beacon to go off. And there's a little bit of common sense. Is it at an airport or is it out in the boonies? Similarly, if it's a EPIRB or maritime beacon that has to be water activated, you expect it would be overboard in there for indicative of an emergency. If you get a PLB and use it in those environments, it's not quite as clear. But the people who are running the JRCCs, as I said, in those early phases of the distress, will do a lot of checking out. And if you're using a database registered system, you'll have points of contact, and then they'll try to get a hold of them and verify some information there. You know, do you have any reason to believe why this person would be here and be in distress at this time? So there are preliminary actions that are routine in handling any emergency, whether it's police or boat or airplane or so on.
We have a question online from Eric. Is the international community having more difficulty organizing itself to deal with the space junk problem than it did in moving to put international search and rescue into operation?
I think the answer to that question is pretty obvious. Somebody made a movie about that, didn't they? Somebody running a garbage truck up there in space collecting the junk. That may be coming in days ahead, who knows? It's getting congested up there.
Okay, looks like we've run out of questions, but I think that it's pretty obvious that this topic, although it's not something that we really hear about very often, has triggered a lot of interest. So thank you very much for coming out. I do have a couple of little tokens, so I can just get behind you here. I'd like to present you with a couple of little tokens of thanks for your talk.
Thank you.
And again, thank you very much for telling us all about COSPAS-SARSAT.
Yes, if anybody wants some souvenirs, we've got some stickers from the early days of the project here that you're welcome to help yourself to.
Thank you very much.